in a bustling city of Lagos, its streets alive with the rhythmic hum of cars and the chatter of traders. In the heart of this vibrant city lived Chris and Linda, a couple whose love seemed like a fairy tale. Married for 5 years, their bond was the envy of many. Chris, a charismatic businessman, and Linda, a determined entrepreneur, had built a life of comfort and companionship. Yet, behind the walls of their tastefully decorated home lay a storm they could no longer ignore. Linda sat on the couch, her slender fingers tracing the intricate patterns on her skirt. Her caramel skin glistened under the soft light of the chandelier, but her eyes carried a shadow of despair. Chris's mother, Mama Rose, had just ended another call, her voice still echoing in Linda's mind. "You barren woman, what use are you to my son? I told him not to marry you." Linda held the phone tightly, her lips trembling as tears streamed down her face. This was not the first time Mama Rose had hurled such insults at her. The older woman had never approved of her, blaming her for the couple's inability to conceive. Linda's heart ached, not just from the words, but from the fact that Chris had become increasingly silent in the face of his mother's tirades. As if sensing her distress, Chris walked into the room. His tall frame leaned against the doorway, and his kind eyes softened when he saw her tears. "Linda," he said gently, approaching her. "Why are you crying again?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "It's nothing." Chris sat beside her, pulling her into his arms. "Don't let my mother get to you. You know how she is." "But Chris," Linda whispered, her voice cracking. "She hates me. She blames me for everything. I can't take this anymore." He sighed, brushing his fingers through her braided hair. "We've talked about this, haven't we? God's time is the best. Don't let her words break you. I love you, and that's what matters." Linda wanted to believe him, but the weight of their childless marriage was becoming unbearable. They had tried everything, or so she thought. Each year, with no sign of a baby, Mama Rose's attacks grew fiercer. Later that evening, as Chris prepared for bed, Linda stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her once vibrant spirit had dulled, replaced by a woman constantly questioning her worth. She turned to Chris, who was scrolling through his phone. "Chris, do you ever wish things were different?" she asked cautiously. He glanced up, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "I mean, with us. Do you wish we had children by now?" Chris set his phone aside and reached for her hand. "Linda, you're enough for me. Children will come when the time is right. Let's not lose ourselves in this." She nodded, but her heart remained heavy. She wanted to believe him, yet the fear of losing him lingered like a shadow in the corners of her mind. The following morning, Linda went about her usual routine, masking her pain with a smile as she managed her thriving business. Her boutique, a hub for women across Lagos, was a sanctuary where she poured her energy. Yet even amidst the laughter and chatter of her clients, her thoughts often drifted back to her marriage. Chris, too, seemed to bury himself in work. They still shared moments of affection, but an invisible wall was forming between them. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, Chris's phone buzzed. He frowned, glancing at the screen before putting it away. "Who was that?" Linda asked softly. "Just my mom," he replied, his tone dismissive. Linda nodded, biting her lip. She knew what Mama Rose wanted, and it was a conversation Chris avoided discussing with her. As the days turned into weeks, the tension in their home grew. Chris began spending more time at work, and Linda found herself retreating further into her world. The whispers of doubt and insecurity grew louder in her mind. One fateful evening, as the sun dipped below the Lagos skyline, Linda sat on the balcony sipping tea. She gazed at the bustling streets below, wondering how many couples shared her struggles. Her thoughts were interrupted by her phone ringing. "Hello?" she answered, recognizing Mama Rose's number. "You useless woman," the voice barked on the other end. "Are you proud of yourself? 5 years, and you can't even give my son a child. God will punish you." Linda's chest tightened as the words cut through her like shards of glass. She wanted to hang up but found herself frozen, her tears falling silently. "You should leave my son alone," Mama Rose continued. "He deserves better." The call ended abruptly, leaving Linda trembling. She clutched the phone to her chest, her sobs echoing in the quiet night. When Chris returned later that night, he found Linda curled up on the couch, her face buried in her hands. "Linda, What's wrong? He asked, kneeling beside her. She looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen. Chris, how much longer can we live like this? Your mother will never accept me. She'll never stop blaming me. Chris frowned, his jaw tightening. I told you. Don't let her words get to you. But she's your mother, Chris. Her words matter, and they're tearing me apart. Chris stood, running a hand through his hair. Linda, I can't control what she says. All I can do is remind you that I love you. Isn't that enough? Linda stared at him, her heart aching. She wanted his love to be enough, but the cracks in their marriage were deepening. As the night wore on, she lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The weight of their struggles pressed down on her, and for the first time, she began to wonder if love alone could withstand the storm. It was a warm Saturday morning in Lagos, and Linda stood by the kitchen window, watching the bustling street below. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, and the soft hum of her favorite gospel music played in the background. Chris was seated at the dining table, reading through some documents. Honey, breakfast is ready, she said, setting down a plate of toast, eggs, and fried plantains. Chris glanced up and smiled. Thanks, love. They sat together, eating in companionable silence. But Linda's heart felt heavy, her mind replaying the hurtful words from Mama Rose's call the night before. She forced a smile, not wanting to ruin the moment. After breakfast, Chris cleared his throat. Linda, I need to let you know something. She looked up, her heart skipping a beat. What is it? I'll be traveling for a business trip tomorrow, he said. It's an important deal, and I'll be gone for a few days. Linda nodded, though she felt a pang of disappointment. She always dreaded his trips, not because she doubted him, but because his absence often left her vulnerable to Mama Rose's relentless attacks. Okay, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I'll miss you. Chris reached across the table and held her hand. I'll miss you too. But you know this trip is important for us. Once the deal goes through, we'll be able to expand the business. Linda nodded, her fingers tightening around him. I understand. I'll prepare everything you need. The following morning, Linda was up early, packing Chris's suitcase. She carefully folded his shirts, placed his toiletries in a neat bag, and made sure he had everything he might need. As she zipped up the suitcase, Chris walked into the room, freshly showered and dressed. Everything ready? He asked. Yes, Linda replied, forcing a smile. Chris pulled her into a hug. Thank you, my love. I'll call you as soon as I land. They kissed passionately, a moment of tenderness that reminded Linda of why she had fallen in love with him. She watched as he loaded his suitcase into the car and drove off, waving until his car disappeared down the street. The house felt emptier without Chris. Linda busied herself with chores, trying to ignore the loneliness creeping in. But her peace was short-lived. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, and the screen flashed Mama Rose. Linda hesitated before answering. Hello, Mama, she said, trying to keep her voice polite. You still have the audacity to call me Mama? Mama Rose's voice was sharp and full of disdain. What kind of useless woman are you? 5 years no child. My son made the biggest mistake marrying you. Linda's hand trembled as she gripped the phone. Mama, please? Don't please me. Mama Rose snapped. Do you think I'll sit back and watch you ruin my son's life? He needs a real woman, not a barren failure like you. If you have any shame, you leave him and let him find happiness. The line went dead. Linda sank to the floor, her shoulders shaking as though trying to contain the pain. Why, God? She whispered. Why am I going through this? She sat there for what felt like hours, the weight of Mama Rose's words crushing her spirit. But deep down, she knew she couldn't let this break her. She had to find out if there was something she could do to save her marriage. The next morning, Linda woke up determined. She dressed in a simple blouse and jeans, grabbed her car keys, and drove to the hospital. The reception area buzzed with activity, but Linda's resolve didn't waver. Good morning, she said to the nurse at the front desk. I'd like to see a doctor. After a short wait, she was called into the doctor's office. Dr. Williams, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, greeted her warmly. What brings you here today, Mrs. Chris? He asked, glancing at her file. Linda hesitated, then took a deep breath. Doctor, I've been married for 5 years, but I haven't been able to conceive. I need to know if something is wrong with me. Dr. Williams nodded. I understand. Let's start by running some tests to check your fertility. The tests were thorough, and Linda tried to stay calm as the nurses worked. When they were done, she sat in the waiting area, her heart pounding with anxiety. Mrs. Chris? A nurse called. Linda stood and followed her. Back to the doctor's office, Dr. Williams gestured for her to sit. Good news, Mrs. Chris, he said with a reassuring smile. All your tests came back normal. You're perfectly healthy and fertile. Linda felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly replaced by confusion. So, there's nothing wrong with me? She asked. Not at all, Dr. Williams replied. But I'd recommend that your husband also come in for testing. Fertility issues can affect both partners, and it's important to rule out any potential problems on his side. Linda nodded, clutching the results. Thank you, doctor. I'll talk to him about it. As she drove home, Linda's mind raced. She had always assumed the problem lay with her, but now she realized they needed to face this together. That evening, Linda sat in the living room, waiting for Chris to return from his trip. When she heard the sound of his car in the driveway, her heart skipped a beat. Welcome back, honey, she said, rushing to greet him. Chris smiled and kissed her on the cheek. It's good to be home. How have you been? I've been fine, Linda replied. How was your trip? Productive, he said, dropping his briefcase on the couch. I'm starving though. Can you get me something to eat? Of course, Linda said, hurrying to the kitchen. As she prepared his meal, she placed her test results on the couch beside his briefcase. When she returned with his food, she found him holding the papers, his brows furrowed. What are these? He asked, glancing up at her. They're my test results, Linda said, setting the food on the dining table. Test results? I went to the hospital while you were away, she explained. I wanted to know if everything was okay with me. The doctor said I'm fine and fertile. Chris's expression darkened. So, what are you trying to say? Linda hesitated. The doctor suggested you should get tested too. It's important to rule out all possibilities. Chris's jaw tightened. Are you saying there's something wrong with me? No, that's not what I'm saying, Linda said quickly. I just think it's something we should do together for us. Chris stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I don't need to be tested. I'm not the problem here. Chris, please don't take this the wrong way. I said I don't need to be tested, he snapped, storming out of the room. Linda stood frozen, her heart sinking. She had hoped he would understand, but his reaction only deepened the rift between them. That night, Chris barely spoke to Linda. He spent hours in the living room, staring at the TV without really watching it. When he finally came to bed, he lay with his back to her, his silence cutting deeper than words. Linda stared at the ceiling, tears slipping down her cheeks. She had tried to do the right thing, but it felt like everything was falling apart. The days that followed were no better. Chris began staying out late, often coming home smelling of alcohol. He avoided conversations about their struggles, and his once loving demeanor turned cold. Linda tried to hold on, clinging to the hope that their love could withstand the storm. But as the cracks in their relationship widened, she couldn't ignore the growing fear in her heart. They were losing each other. The silence in the house was unbearable. Days turned into weeks, and the once loving home Linda had cherished now felt like a battleground. Chris's late nights became more frequent, and Linda's attempts to bridge the gap between them were met with cold indifference. One evening, Linda sat at the dining table, staring at the untouched meal she had prepared. She glanced at the clock. 9:45 p.m. Chris wasn't home yet. Her mind raced with questions she didn't want to answer. Where was he? Who was he with? The sound of a car engine in the driveway pulled her out of her thoughts. Moments later, Chris walked in, his shirt rumpled, and the smell of alcohol clinging to him. You're late again, Linda said, her voice trembling. Chris shrugged, tossing his keys on the table. I had business to handle. Business? Linda stood, her frustration bubbling over. Chris, you've been coming home late every night. This isn't just about business. Talk to me. What's going on? Chris turned to her, his eyes cold. I don't owe you any explanations. Linda, maybe if you focused more on fixing yourself instead of nagging, we wouldn't be in this mess. Linda recoiled as if he had slapped her. Fix myself? She whispered, tears welling up. I've done everything I can. Chris, I went to the doctor. I got tested, and I'm trying to find solutions. But you won't even try. How is this my fault? Chris sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. I don't want to have this conversation right now. When, Chris? Linda cried. When will we talk about this? Or do you just want to keep pretending everything is fine while our marriage falls apart? Chris stared at her for a moment, then shook his head. You don't get it, do you? I'm tired, Linda. Tired of the pressure. Tired of the blame. Tired of everything. He grabbed his keys and headed for the door. Where are you going? Linda asked, her voice breaking. Out, he said without looking back, slamming the door behind him. The next morning, Linda woke up to the sound of her phone buzzing. Groggily, she reached for it, her heart sinking when she saw Mama Rose's name on the screen. She hesitated before answering. Good morning, Mama, she said, her voice weak. Linda, Mama Rose began, her tone sharp. What exactly is your plan? To frustrate my son to the point where he regrets marrying you. Linda closed her eyes, her hand gripping the phone tightly. Mama, please? Don't please me. Mama Rose interrupted. Chris told me what happened last night. How dare you accuse him of being the problem? You're the barren one, Linda, not my son. Linda felt her chest tighten, the weight of Mama Rose's words crushing her. Mama, I've done everything I can. The doctors said I'm fine. They suggested Chris get tested too, but he refuses. Enough. Mama Rose snapped. You will not insult my son like that. Mark my words, Linda. If you don't give him a child soon, I will make sure he marries someone who can. The line went dead, leaving Linda trembling with anger and despair. Later that day, Linda decided to visit her friend Clara for some solace. Clara was a lawyer and had been Linda's confidant since their university days. She welcomed Linda into her home with a warm hug. You look terrible, Clara said, leading her to the couch. What's going on? Linda broke down, recounting everything from Chris's late nights to Mama Rose's relentless attacks. Clara listened quietly, her brow furrowed with concern. Linda, this is too much, Clara said when Linda finished. You can't keep letting them treat you like this. You've done nothing wrong. I don't know what to do, Clara, Linda said, her voice shaking. I love Chris, but I feel like I'm losing him. And Mama Rose, she hates me. Clara reached for Linda's hand. You need to stand up for yourself. Linda, you've been bending over backward to save this marriage, but Chris has to meet you halfway. And as for Mama Rose, her opinions don't define you. You're not barren. You're not a failure. Don't let her words break you. Linda nodded, wiping her tears. I just want things to go back to the way they were. They can, Clara said gently, but only if Chris is willing to work with you. If he's not, then you need to decide how much more you're willing to take. That evening, Linda returned home feeling slightly stronger. Clara's words had given her a glimmer of hope, but her resolve was tested when Chris walked in with a young woman by his side. Chris, Linda said, standing in the living room. Who is this? This is Sharon, Chris said casually, as though introducing a colleague. She'll be staying here for a while. Linda's heart dropped. What do you mean, staying here? She's pregnant, Chris said, his tone matter of fact. It's my child. Linda felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. Your child? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Yes, Chris said, his expression unrepentant. You couldn't give me a child, Linda, so I had to find someone who could. Linda stared at him in disbelief, her chest heaving with pain and anger. How could you do this to me, Chris? After everything we've been through? Chris shrugged. I did what I had to do. You can either accept it or leave. The words hit Linda like a slap. She turned to Sharon, who stood silently, avoiding her gaze.